Hi everyone, Miss Martinez here. In case you were wondering, this lovely creature in my hands and on your computer screens is a Pokemon called Sylveon. And Sylveon is my favorite Pokemon. So, I bet now you're wondering why I have a Pokemon up on the screen. And the reason is that Pokemon are well known for their ability to evolve. And that's our topic today. We're going to be talking about evolution. Evolution, quite simply, is just change over time. Now, it's a fact that organisms change over time. If you remember from last week, I had this slide here that showed how I, Miss Martinez, have evolved over time from 1994 all the way up to 2020. As you can see, I've changed, specifically my hair. Now, the theory of evolution is how organisms have changed throughout Earth's entire history. And throughout the rest of the presentation today, we're going to talk about the different evidences for the theory of evolution. There are 6 main pieces of evidence that we're going to be talking about, and those are fossils, comparative anatomy, embryology, biochemistry, genetics, and direct observation. Let's start with fossils. Fossils are traces of organisms that lived a long, long time ago. Fossil records can be used to see how old those fossils are. So if you look at this image here, this is showing a lot of different layers of the earth, and how deep you go tells you how old that layer of the earth is. So if you find a fossil here in the Cretaceous era, which is 145.5 millions of years ago, you can get a pretty good idea that this fossil is 145 million years old, right? Now, these fossil records are incomplete because organisms are made of soft tissue, and the weather can also destroy fossils. Here is an example of a fossil. This is a skeleton of a bird-like specimen that was found in China, and it was really well preserved. Fossils can be really useful and give you a lot of information, like the geographic distribution of species. So if you find similar organisms in different areas, you can make inferences about how those species have moved over time. And fossils are also really great pieces to give us information about organisms that are extinct. So here's an organism that is extinct. It is the fossil of a Seymoria. I think it's really cute. All right, our next piece of evidence is comparative anatomy. Comparative anatomy is just how it's the study of when you compare structures of different organisms to each other to find out more about it. With comparative anatomy, what scientists mostly focus on is looking at homologous structures. If you remember, the prefix homo means similar, or it means the same. So a homologous structure are similar structures that have been modified and have different uses between different organisms. The more similar the structures are, then the closer the relationship between those two organisms are. An example of a homologous structure is a bat's wing, a horse's leg, and a human forearm. Here is an example of a homologous structures between 4 different species. So you see here a human forearm, a cat's foreleg, a whale's flipper, and a bat's wing. These bones that are the same color are your homologous structures. You can see how all 4 organisms have similar bones in similar places, and that's what a homologous structure is. Another piece of comparative anatomy is looking at vestigial organs. Vestigial organs are structures that have no function in present organisms, but they may have been used in ancestors. So an example of animals is the pelvic bone that you see in some snakes and whales. Now, as you know, snakes and whales don't have legs, so that pelvic bone is pretty useless right now, but their ancestors may have used it if they used to walk on land. An example of a vestigial organ in humans are our appendix, wisdom teeth, body hair, and pointed canines. Here is an example of a transitional fossil. So you see here a vestigial organ. This animal here has a pelvic bone and some homologous structures here in its flipper, but it's obviously an aquatic organism, so it's not using these pelvic bones to walk. Our next piece of evidence is embryology. Comparative embryology is the study of embryos, which are the early stages of life of different organisms. The more similar the embryos are, the more closely related those two organisms are. For example, human and pig embryos appear very similar to each other. Here is a more visual example. These are 6 different organisms of 6 very different species, but in their earliest stages of the embryo, you can't tell them apart, can you? Here they are later on in their gestation period. So after they've developed for a little while, this is like the next step. And now you start to see some more differences. So these 2 organisms are obviously more aquatic, whereas these are most likely mammals. But these 4 still look really similar to each other. Finally, here you see the more late stages of the embryo or of the fetus, and you can see some more structures that are distinct and different between them. Can you tell what these organisms are now? Well, here we go. This blue organism was a fish. Here's a salamander, a turtle, chicken, rabbit, and human. Now, in these later stages, you can see the differences more clearly, but at the very early stages of that embryo, we pretty much all look the same. Our next piece of evidence is biochemistry and genetics. So before we get into that, I want to do a quick review of what we talked about before, and that's genetic variation. Those are the differences in our genes that make us all different from each other. And how we get those differences and those genes, that's what leads to evolution in the long run, right? A combination of all of those differences leading to a change over time. So those differences get there in 3 main ways. You have meiosis, which is when individuals are making those sex cells, and those sex cells are genetically very different from each other, thanks to different events that happen, like crossing over and independent assortment. Next, we have mutations, which are just random changes in DNA. So your genes can change just randomly, just like that. And finally, you get genetic variation through sex when you're combining 2 individuals' DNA together to have this combination or mix of them in a new organism. Now that we talked about the differences, let's talk about how these can be used as evidences for evolution. So biochemistry and genetics, when you look into it, right, these chemicals like proteins, DNA, mRNA, etc., they are similar in different organisms. So the more similar those chemicals are, the more closely related the organisms are. For example, hemoglobin, which is a protein found in blood, in chimpanzees is very similar to the hemoglobin that you see in humans. DNA sequences of all living things have a lot of similarities, more than you might think. So the DNA of chimpanzees and humans is 98% identical, and the DNA of humans and other mammals is 80% identical. Here is an example of the hemoglobin sequences in vertebrates. So these are organisms that have a spine, right? So between humans and this rhesus monkey, there's only 8 differences in the chain of amino acids that make up our hemoglobin. And then as we go on and on and on, you see there's more and more differences. Direct observation is our final piece of evidence for evolution, and direct observation are the evolutionary changes that are happening now that you can actually see in a lifetime. So one main example is bacteria becoming resistant to antibiotics. So you have a lot of germs and some are drug resistant. Antibiotics will kill the bacteria that cause the illness, but some are resistant to the drug. So the drug resistant ones can now grow, they can take over, and now all of a sudden you have this new strain of bacteria that is resistant to antibiotics and the medicine doesn't work on them anymore. So this is an example of evolutionary changes happening to a bacteria, antibiotic resistant bacteria. So as a quick recap, we have 6 main evidences for evolution, and that is fossils, comparative anatomy, embryology, biochem, genetics, and direct observation.